Hello and welcome. Before psychology became a science, before there were diagnoses, manuals, or experiments, people were already trying to understand the mind. They did it through stories, through reflection, through philosophy. They asked why we suffer, why we repeat the same patterns, and how a human life can be lived with more clarity and less pain. In this video, we'll go back to the beginning, to a time when thinking about the mind was not separate from thinking about how to live. There's no rush here. This is a slow journey into the roots of psychology, long before it had a name. Thank you for being here. Long before psychology became a discipline, long before experiments, diagnoses, and therapies, human beings were already deeply concerned with the mind. They asked why people suffer, why desire can overpower reason, why thoughts can calm us or destroy us, why some lives feel meaningful and others unbearable. They did not call this psychology. They called it philosophy, ethics, wisdom, or the study of the soul. In this first part, we return to a time when thinking about the mind was not a profession, but a necessity. When understanding inner life was inseparable from the question of how to live. Psychology did not begin in laboratories. It began in reflection, conversation, and lived struggle. The Greek word psyche did not mean mind in the modern sense. It meant breath, life force, that which animates the body. To speak of the psyche was not to speak of cognition alone, but of emotion, motivation, character, and destiny. The earliest thinkers did not separate, thinking from feeling, body from mind, inner life from ethical life. To understand the psyche was to understand the human being as a whole. This holistic perspective is something modern psychology had to rediscover after centuries of fragmentation. Plato was one of the first thinkers to describe the mind as internally divided. In the Republic, he compared the soul to a chariot pulled by two horses, one noble and disciplined, one impulsive and driven by appetite. Reason, the charioteer, struggles to guide them. This image is deeply psychological. Plato did not see inner conflict as abnormal. He saw it as universal. Human suffering, in his view, arises when reason loses its guiding role and desire takes over. The task of life, therefore, is not the elimination of desire, but its integration. Already here we find themes that will reappear thousands of years later. Self-regulation, impulse control, internal conflict, the struggle between short-term relief and long-term good. Plato's philosophy is not therapy, but it is a map of the inner terrain. If Plato looked inward toward ideals, Aristotle looked outward toward experience. Aristotle rejected the idea that the soul was separate from the body. For him, the psyche was the form of the living body, inseparable from perception, movement, and action. He studied memory, habit, learning, emotion, motivation. Aristotle understood that character is shaped through repeated action. We become what we practice. This idea quietly anticipates behavioral psychology, but without reducing humans to machines. For Aristotle, emotion was not an enemy of reason. It was something that could be educated. Psychological health, in his view, meant balance, the famous golden mean. This is not symptom reduction, it is character formation. The Stoics, especially Epictetus, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius, moved even closer to what we would recognize as modern cognitive psychology. They observed that people are often not distressed by events themselves, but by the judgments they make about those events. This insight is foundational to the Stoics. Emotions were not random forces. They were shaped by beliefs and interpretations. If you believe something is unbearable, you suffer more. If you believe something is survivable, you suffer less. Stoicism taught practices remarkably similar to later therapeutic techniques, examining thoughts, reframing interpretations, practicing acceptance of what cannot be changed. Cognitive behavioral therapy would later echo these ideas almost verbatim. The Stoics were not cold or emotionless. They were deeply concerned with human suffering and deeply practical. While Western philosophy developed these ideas, Eastern traditions were constructing equally sophisticated psychologies, often starting from different assumptions. Buddhism begins not with metaphysics, but with suffering. The Buddha asked, "Why do humans suffer even when their basic needs are met?" His answer was psychological. craving, aversion, identification with thought. Buddhism describes the mind as a process, not a fixed entity. Thoughts arise and pass. Emotions arise and pass. Suffering increases when we cling to them. This is not a moral judgment. It is an observation of mental dynamics. Modern mindfulness-based therapies would later rediscover this insight with scientific language. Taoism offered another psychological insight, that excessive control creates imbalance. The principle of Wu Wei, non-forcing, suggests that many problems arise not because we do too little, but because we push too hard. Emotionally, this means forcing calm increases anxiety, forcing certainty increases fear, forcing control increases tension. This understanding resonates strongly with modern acceptance-based therapies. What unites these ancient traditions is not theory, but purpose. Philosophy was not an abstract discipline. It was a way of training attention, emotion, and action. People studied philosophy to live better, suffer less, act wisely, die well. There was no separation between understanding the mind and shaping one's life. This unity would later be lost and painfully missed. As centuries passed, philosophy became more abstract. The soul became a concept rather than a lived experience. Yet the questions never disappeared. Why do we repeat harmful patterns? Why do thoughts feel so convincing? Why is insight not always enough to change? These unanswered questions quietly prepared the ground for psychology. Philosophy planted the seeds. Psychology would later try to measure the plant. Before psychology became a science, before it became a profession, it was a human necessity. Philosophy was the first psychology, a careful, sometimes poetic attempt to understand the invisible forces shaping human life. At some point, the questions changed. Instead of asking, how should we live? People began to ask, how does this work? The world was no longer approached as a living whole, but as a system that could be taken apart, measured, and understood piece by piece. This shift would transform science, medicine, and technology, and it would profoundly reshape how humans understood their own minds. Psychology, as we know it today, was born not only from curiosity, but from a deep fracture in how reality itself was imagined. During the Renaissance, the human being moved to the center of attention. Art, science, and philosophy began to emphasize observation, individuality, and human reason. The universe was no longer only a divine order. It was something to be studied. This was liberating, but it also placed a new burden on the individual mind. If the world could be understood rationally, then the mind became the primary instrument of truth. Slowly, the inner world began to separate from the outer one. No figure symbolizes this separation more clearly than René Descartes. In his search for certainty, Descartes doubted everything that could be doubted. The senses, the body, even the external world. What remained was thinking itself. I think, therefore I am. With this sentence, the mind became the foundation of existence, but it came at a cost. Descartes divided reality into two substances, res extensa, the extended physical world, res cogitans, the thinking immaterial mind. The body became a machine. The mind became an observer inside it. This dualism shaped centuries of Western thought. Psychologically, it planted a powerful image, a lonely mind looking out at the world from behind the eyes. Once the body was understood as a machine, it could be studied, repaired, optimized. This led to extraordinary medical progress, but the mind became strangely detached. Emotions were difficult to place. Subjective experience resisted measurement. The soul, once the center of philosophical inquiry, began to fade into abstraction. This created a tension that psychology would later inherit. How do you study something that cannot be weighed, seen, or dissected? While rationalists like Descartes trusted reason, empiricists turned to experience. Thinkers such as John Locke, George Berkeley, and David Hume argued that the mind begins as a blank slate. Everything we know, we learn through experience. This view emphasized learning, conditioning, association. Psychologically, it suggested that humans are shaped by their environments. But something subtle happened. If the mind is only a product of experience, then inner depth becomes secondary. The richness of subjective life risks being flattened into inputs and outputs. David Hume pushed empiricism to its logical extreme. When he looked inward, he claimed he could not find a stable self, only a bundle of perceptions, sensations, emotions, thoughts. The self, he concluded, is not a substance, but a process. This idea quietly echoes Buddhist philosophy, but in the Western context, it was deeply unsettling. If there is no stable self, what anchors identity? Psychology would later struggle with this question in new forms. Immanuel Kant attempted to heal the growing fracture. He argued that while knowledge begins with experience, it does not arise from experience alone. The mind actively organizes reality, space, time, causality. These are not properties of the world itself, but structures of the human mind. This was a profound insight. The mind is not a passive mirror, it is a lens. Psychologically, this means we never encounter reality directly. We encounter it through mental frameworks. By the end of the Enlightenment, a new image of the human being had emerged, an individual mind, separate from the body, separate from tradition, responsible for meaning and truth. This modern subject was powerful, but also vulnerable. Without shared metaphysical foundations, meaning became fragile. Anxiety, alienation, and self-doubt grew alongside reason. Philosophy had sharpened the tools of thought, but it had not yet learned how to care for the inner cost. When psychology finally emerged as a discipline in the 19th century, it inherited unresolved tensions: mind versus body, measurement versus meaning, objectivity versus subjectivity. It inherited powerful methods and deep confusion. The question was no longer only, what is the mind? But also, how can we study it without destroying what makes it human? The Enlightenment gave us clarity, precision, and scientific power, but it also narrowed the lens. The mind became isolated, the body became mechanical, meaning became uncertain. Psychology would arise from this tension as both a solution and a symptom. In part 2, we will see how psychology officially separated from philosophy, entered the laboratory, and began its long struggle between measurement and meaning. We will also follow psychology as it turns back toward depth through psychoanalysis, symbolism, and existential thought, and watch the pendulum swing once again. Are there specific topics you're interested in or a particular question you'd like answered in your life? Let me know in the comments. Subscribe now and join me on your journey toward more clarity and inner strength.